Public dialogue and civic engagement are important. They play a role in improving the health and well-being of Texans across our great state. That's why Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas is proud to support Texas Tribune events like the conversation you're about to see.
Please give our panelists a hand. Very nice to have all of you here. Thank you very much. Mr. Bullock, I'm going to start with you. I had coffee with Representative Meyer yesterday or the day before, and he said, did you all orchestrate that SMU study on the impact of the oil and gas industry on earthquakes in time for your event? Is there somehow a relationship between the release of that study and your event? No, as it turns out, not. But our good fortune for purposes of this conversation. So as I distill the guts of this report, the suggestion, not just folks from SMU, there were some UT Austin folks and others, put out the word that the earthquake activity here in North Texas is at least in part connected to oil and gas activity, specifically wastewater injections. That's what I understand. That's your reading of the report too.
A couple of things on that, and I owe those geologists over in Earth Science a dinner or something for releasing that this week.
Yes.
It turned out to be quite timely.
Right.
But first of all, the study was specific to Azle.
Right, specific to Azle.
And the basic conclusions were that the injection wells that injected wastewater combined with the water that was coming out as a result of the production created an imbalance in pressure underneath the subsurface, which induced some seismic activity. And it was specific to that area.
But the implication, Mr. Bullock, was that lessons could be drawn from this, extrapolated.
And no question about it.
Yeah.
I think we've known for a long time about the issues around injection wells.
Right.
And the Texas Railroad Commission has looked at that. I think this reaffirms this. This adds another piece to the puzzle, though, in terms of the issues created by the amounts of water that are drawn out as a result of production. Yeah. What this means is, as a result, not only are producers going to have to look at the surface issues related to the communities around them, but they're going to have to look at the subsurface issues as well.
Yeah, Ambassador Garza, you know your way around the Railroad Commission. The Railroad Commission's response to this has been to be skeptical of this study, to cast doubt on whether this study is all that. And in fact, the Railroad Commission has not been entirely favorable to this point of view, that there's a connection between oil and gas activity and earthquakes prior to this report. This doesn't seem to have changed their minds necessarily.
Yeah. Well, a couple of points, and I've not seen the study, obviously. I don't know that anybody's actually gotten into it before. They've either embraced it or rejected, unfortunately. And so, but you are talking about two very credible, very well-regarded institutions in the state. So I think it's a study that we should take seriously, and it should become part of the discussion. I think the bigger question, and you touched on it with respect to the Railroad Commission, is the confidence that Texans are going to have in the regulatory bodies. I sat on that commission for a while, and it is, I'm not going to say troubling, but it is a regulatory body. And I think the place for advocacy for the industry is at the economic development, it's within the industry, and we need a body that people will have confidence in that can do their job. Now, and I don't know which side of the issue anybody's on. I think we simply have to have confidence in the integrity of our regulatory bodies.
Right.
And so, if you look at it, for example, I believe the commission's got one seismologist.
Right.
And is that sufficient resources being dedicated to an issue that increasingly is of concern to Texans? And I guess the last point, and
yes.
I know you want to move on, is that I have a lot of confidence in people to make decisions when given the proper information and to assume certain risks.
Right.
I live in Mexico City. We have earthquakes. People live on the San Andreas Fault. They have earthquakes.
And they've lived there by choice.
And they live there by choice, and we make decisions based on the information that we have, and we make those decisions as to where we live and where we invest. And I think you get the information out there, and people may say, well, I'm going to make a decision about living around this area. There's also that risk reward. Perhaps there's a risk associated, but the reward is a very robust economic development, the number of jobs created, the revenues that flow from it.
Right.
And I just have a great deal of confidence when you put the information out there and allow people to make informed decisions, they're going to make them.
Mr. Chairman, a lot of people who want to believe that fracking has all kinds of negative consequences for our communities and for our state, have drawn from this report, fracking causes earthquakes. That's not exactly what it says.
Yeah. Are you asking me?
I am, indeed. Yeah.
I've not read the report. I have read the executive summary. We got that yesterday. And,
Yeah.
and certainly it's a serious study done by a serious institution, several institutions. And so I have already communicated with Dr. Hornback, and we've set up a meeting. I'm going to have a hearing in Austin.
So you intend to have a hearing at the Capitol on this specific question?
I do, and, and we're going to schedule that a week from Monday. Representative Anchia, who may, is he here yet?
What was going to be?
Representative Chia has a bill we're going to hear, and we're going to invite SMU and Dr. Hornback to attend.
Come down and talk about it.
And start asking some questions regarding the study and how
Right.
we might be able to respond in an appropriate fashion. You know, my job as chairman of the House Energy Resources Committee is to make sure that a regulatory arm, the Texas Railroad Commission and the TCEQ, have the authority to deal with these type of issues. Not only have the authority, but have the resources. And so in the budget process, you know, we wanted to make sure that we implemented one of the measures that came out of a study, the interim study done by the Energy Resources Committee, about how we might fund some mobile arrays that would respond to these type of incidents and
Right.
be able to give us more data. I think all of this has got to be driven by the data, and so the information coming through these studies is very helpful to provide that layer of data. We need to add to that, and my job is to make sure we have the resources to do that.
Do you share Ambassador Garza's concern about whether the Railroad Commission either has enough resources to do this aspect of its job, or whether it's deploying the resources it has currently in the right way?
You know, the Railroad Commission has implemented rules governing
Right.
this situation, and I know the Railroad Commission is going to reach out to Dr. Hornback and others to also perhaps have hearings
Yeah.
with regard to this matter. They have rules in place. They have the ability to regulate, stop, prohibit these operations currently in the rules. It's up to them to implement those.
Right.
And again, I think they need to be data-driven. Does the Railroad Commission have enough data to do that, either from the operator standpoint or through extraneous sources such as the SMU study and certainly UT study? Again, you know, if we're not giving them the tools to do that, then that's my responsibility.
Right.
And I need to make sure they have the tools to do that. And so we're still have part of the session left, and one of the things we're going to be discussing, I know there's a rider in the budget to put the $2.5 million in the form of mobile arrays. Is that enough?
Right. Well,
Should we deploy twice that amount?
this could be a catalyst for further discussion of
And
that.
just to
Yes.
support that last point of Representative Darby, you absolutely want that commission resourced properly because you want the regulation done here in Texas. You don't want them perceived as not having the ability or the authority to do their job in Austin, Texas, regulating an industry
Right.
that we know best.
Well, especially since
And-
our pushback against the federal government has assumed that we want to do it rather than have
And we
them
want to do it correctly, and we don't want to have somebody step in, and certainly out of Washington, trying to regulate what we're doing
Right.
in
Well,
West Texas.
and if I
Representative,
might
please.
If I might just hop in there as well, is talking about the Railroad Commission and their role is that you are seeing a more active Railroad Commission, I think, in this session than maybe you have in the past, and I think that's the best example of that is yesterday. I don't know if y'all are aware, but Commissioner Sitton issued a statement wherein he is asking for a public hearing specifically on this issue, specifically on this report,
Right.
to see what the information actually shows. To Ambassador Garza's point, is that the folks in Austin, and again, I've been there now 2 months, maybe 3-ish, and you have a different perception outside than when you get there. Yeah. And now having been there, folks really do want to make the best decision for Texans, safety included.
Right.
And so that affirmative step by Commissioner Sitton yesterday, I think, is a great example of that. It wasn't a put our head in the sand, we don't agree with this study.
Right.
It was come talk to us about it. What does the evidence show? What does the empirical data show? And I think to Chairman Darby's point as well, it's about our job in the legislature providing them the resources necessary to make those correct decisions.
Now, Representative Meyer, you, as part of the committee and as part of the legislature, were a participant in the discussions over House Bill 40. House Bill 40 was an attempt to walk back from the ability of local communities to regulate or restrict oil and gas activity on their own. This is the so-called debate over local control. This was really occasioned by the vote of the citizens, residents of Denton back in November to ban fracking. Would you talk a little bit about how that conversation does or does not change through the lens of something like this? I heard Ambassador Garza say, well, if you choose to live at the San Andreas Fault, you're making a choice with knowledge in advance that you're living in an area where such activity may take place. Mexico City as well. I'm not sure that any of the Convention and Visitors Bureau information in Azle talks about earthquakes. So I'm not sure that it can be said that in Azle or any place else where this activity is happening, people are going into it with the knowledge that this is going to take place.
Right. Well, HB 40 was a great piece of legislation. Chairman Darby took that football and ran with it. It ended up actually passing in the House with 125 votes, bipartisan support. And Chairman Darby did an excellent job with everyone on the committee and working with all of the stakeholders, being the cities, the Texas Municipal League, which represents 11,000 different cities within our state,
right,
and did a great job brokering a compromise, a deal. And that's what it is when we're dealing with, whether it be state control or local control, is that there's certainly going to be some overlap of what you should be or what you could be doing.
Right.
Chairman Darby did a great job. When he laid out that bill in committee, we were all sitting there, and I don't remember the exact number, Mr. Chairman, but there were at least five witnesses I recall said, hey, after hearing this testimony, I came out, I was here opposed, but hearing what the intent of the bill is,
right,
I now want to work with you. And then at post-committee, Chairman Darby sat down again with the stakeholders involved, those cities, to alleviate their concerns that somehow the state was coming in to rob them of their authority. No, no, no. What we were trying to do is work together, have the state work side by side with the cities to provide a safe way for us to continue to have oil and gas production in the state of Texas.
Now, Chairman Darby, what you understand as well as anybody up here is the fight is not just about whether a community might be able to ban fracking. It's really about whether the state can come in and tell cities what to do. And we've been hearing for so many years, we like local control in the state of Texas. When we push back against the federal government, that's an assertion of our local control as a state. There has seemed to be something inconsistent about the state then turning around and saying, well, we want local control, but we don't want to give communities local control. Tell us why this is not, in fact, the proper response to a bill like this.
Well, certainly everybody in this room recognizes the importance of the oil and gas industry to the state of Texas. It funds our roads, it funds our schools, it funds our economy with jobs, sales taxes, equipment purchases, all of that. The significance of 40 is not go unnoticed. I picked the number 40 because oil and gas represents 40% of the Texas economy. Therefore, I filed HB 40 in order to protect 40% of the economy of the state of Texas. Now,
you believe those kinds of bans like what we saw in Denton last week threaten or have the potential to threaten the economy?
It certainly has the potential. Certainly no one wants a patchwork of regulatory environment throughout the state of Texas. To correct my learned colleague, Representative Meyer, I think there are 1,100 cities, not 11,000. But by the way, you've sent a great representative to the Texas House. He has been a terrific member, active, energetic, thoughtful, and I just wanted to congratulate everyone in this room that had a part in sending us a great representative and Representative Meyer. But we can't have a patchwork. When we talk about energy in 5 years, where would energy in 5 years be if we had 1,100 different regulatory environments for the oil and gas industry? You can't have that. The industry has to have consistency, regulatory certainty in order to invest millions and billions of dollars for this industry. And so we needed to establish once and for all the priority of the state of Texas to regulate anything below ground. Anything below the surface of the ground, that is the state's responsibility. And so for the first time ever, there was never regulatory and statutory authority for states to regulate above ground activity with regard to oil and gas operations. Never has it been in statute. The cities have the ability to regulate oil and gas operations above the ground. We gave that to them. We recognized that they have a responsibility to protect the health and safety of folks who live in their city. And we said, you have the ability to do these things, reasonable setbacks, noise, lights, traffic, health, safety, fire. You have the ability to do that. We set that in statute for the first time ever. That was a victory. And we set in statute standards by which we would view these city ordinances. We said you can do this, but they must be commercially reasonable. And we set a standard to view all of these, to gauge them, not only for the operator, but for the city. And we said, answering to the concerns of cities, saying, well, what about the ordinances we've had in place for a number of years? We've given them a safe harbor. We have said, if you've had an ordinance on the books for 5 years and there's been oil and gas operations under that ordinance, then it is presumed prima facie evidence that that is a reasonable ordinance.
Right.
And so we have set protections in statute for the first time ever that will establish the priority relationship between the state's responsibility under the Texas Constitution, Article 16, Section 59, I believe, that charges the legislature with the responsibility of protecting the natural resources of the state. That is my obligation as a member of the Texas legislature and chairman of the House Energy Resources Committee to protect the natural resources of this state.
And the recourse, Mr. Chairman, before I ask Ambassador Garza to talk about the economic impact, as you've alluded to.
But this is a very good point, because I think there are some things that are properly the domain of the state and some things that belong within the municipalities. And I think that's one of the things that the legislature had to wrestle with this. The other issue, and it's one of these issues that you got to be awfully proud of this state. 10 years ago when I was on the commission, you're right, we were a lot less active. There may have been 2 permits issued in the Eagle Ford, and they were both by mistake. And now what you've seen is this mashup of horizontal drilling and fracturing, creating this whole revolution out there. That's innovation and that's investment. And so the government is lagging a little bit in terms of keeping up with the private sector. God, we all know that's always the case. It's the private sector that has innovated and invested and created these challenges for government. So I think that's actually a good thing. If Bruce were to speak, which has happened in the last 10 years, it is a phenomenal thing that's happened out there. It shouldn't surprise anybody that we're wrestling with these questions in this legislature.
You would agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you look in Texas now, we've got 2 of the 3 largest oil fields in the United States now, and that's a result of a stable regulatory environment combined with the technology that you're speaking about. Right. One more thing about House Bill 40. I spent almost a year and a half on the Dallas City Council Study Commission on trying to come up with an ordinance for drilling in Dallas. And I can tell you, we spent more time trying to figure out what Austin could regulate versus what Dallas could regulate, and it's now being litigated than anything else. The ability to be able to have some clarity around that now was much, much needed. And I can certainly understand now why some of the municipalities will certainly benefit from that.
And even if it means ceding control back to Austin, that clarity is worth it.
Absolutely.
It is. Ambassador Garza, what Representative Darby says about, Chairman Darby says about the economy and the benefits to the economy of all this activity over the last number of years, undeniable. The state's economy weathered the recession of the first decade of this century better than almost any other state. More jobs created in Texas over the first 15 years of the 2000s than every other state combined on a net job growth basis. Most jobs created of any state over the last 3 years. Much of that tied to the health of the energy economy. No question about that.
Without a doubt.
Right. A lot of these communities that have seen enormous wealth come online have also had some questions about things like water quality and access, air quality, the so-called oil sector roads, the degree to which the roads in their communities have had heavy truck traffic and all that. Help us understand the balance. You know, people often talk about are we in the state, and energy is often cited in this conversation, victims of our own success? We've had so much activity that we're beginning to see some of the infrastructure resources of the state strain under all this.
I don't know if I wouldn't use the word victims. And you were kind enough not to go too far back on my bio to my time as a Boy Scout and a county judge in South Texas. But as a local official, during what I would characterize as one of the first big waves of growth along the border in the late 70s, early 80s related to the maquila industry, we recognized pretty quickly that we were seeing this growth, but both the state and DC didn't have an appreciation for the need to build overall capacity, whether it was roads or waters or schools and these sorts of things.
Right.
And I think variation on that same thing, you're seeing it in the Eagle Ford, and I think it's important that as a state that we recognize this relationship that we have in Mexico with Canada and Canada. This morning I was reading a piece where there was a comment, and I think there's $1 trillion worth of sort of three-way trade within the NAFTA countries, 40% of which is related to energy.
Yep.
That is not an insignificant amount. That is something that I think as a state, when we look at the border and we see this reform that's going on in Mexico, we have to think, how can we further integrate our energy markets? What is it going to take in terms of smart development to do that, whether it's the pipeline or the investing in the infrastructure or the impacts in communities? It's important that the state lead on these issues, because when we're not leading on these issues, communities push back in the way, perhaps, some variation on the theme that you saw in Denton.
Right.
When you're feeling as a community that, quote, you are bearing the brunt of other people's economic growth, well, then you tend to push back, and many times viscerally, not thoughtfully.
Right.
So I think one of the things that in a conference like this, where you look at 5 years, you take a big step back and you say, okay, what do we need to do in the state of Texas so that we're regulating in a way that is still allowing for the growth and investment and the job creation that is attendant to the industry? But what are we also doing to see this region, this Texas, position itself between Canada and Mexico as what is rightfully ours?
Right.
The premier, the leader on energy and growth. And I think those are the bigger questions, because there's a tendency not to want to invest when things are kind of going good. And if you don't get out ahead of these issues, there's a pushback.
Well, it's more expensive to do after the fact than it is. Representative, Ambassador raised a good point. And whose responsibility is it to be sure 5 years out that we're doing the investing that we need to do to be sure that our resources are adequate? Is it industry's responsibility? Is it the state's responsibility? Is it the community's responsibility?
I think it's everyone's responsibility.
Yeah.
It's everyone's responsibility. I mean, it's such a big lift that we all have to work in concert and work together to do so.
Yeah.
I also want to make the point, when looking out 5 years, is that we're not just going to be talking about oil and gas. We're going to be talking about wind.
Well, we'll come
okay,
to that,
which I mean,
it's got to be not just limited to oil and gas.
Absolutely, we got to have a full portfolio, as if you were investing. You want to have as many resources as possible, and I feel like it is certainly a community effort. It's not just one of us; it's all of us working together. Right,
Chairman Darby, actually, Representative Meyer brings up the point I was going to make to you. It has to be any and all in a portfolio, because if you rely on one, if you put all your eggs in one basket and that basket develops a hole at the bottom, no eggs.
Absolutely.
We just saw in March, for the first time in 53 months, job losses in Texas. No question that the state has put many of its eggs, if not all of its eggs, in the oil and gas basket as relates to the economy. And we've seen over the last couple of months, as the oil and gas economy in Texas has slowed, the economy of the state of Texas has slowed. So how do you hedge against that? Have we gotten a little bit too far out in relying on oil and gas to be the engine for the state's economy?
You know, I think we've used our resources to work with oil and gas to put us where we are today.
Right.
We've certainly not relied upon the oil and gas industry. Energy resources means all our energy resources.
Right.
It's all of the above. We've invested as a state $7 billion in creating competitive reinvestment zones and transmission lines to various parts of the state. The folks here in Dallas, Texas, and the Metroplex benefit from lines strung through rural Texas, where I live, burdening the landscape, certainly, but recognizing that that investment must have meaning. We don't want to spend $7 billion preparing this state for the new horizon, new energy sources, unless we have production at the end of those lines,
Right.
which means wind, which means solar. And solar has become far more competitive than they've been ever
Right.
in technology and manufacturing. Certainly wind, we are by far the leader in the United States, if not the world, in developing our wind resources. So,
Although there seems to be, Chairman, some sense that maybe we haven't leveraged the opportunity that wind presents adequately. Wind really hasn't turned out to be as much of a factor as we thought it
well, I
would.
mean, 10%. I mean, on some days much more than that, but wind has been the margin of reserve on several days in the recent past, generating enough capacity to bridge us over through major usage of energy in this state.
Mr. Bullock, have we done a good enough job of diversifying our portfolio so that we can rely on things other than oil and gas to be an economic driver? Because again, what we're seeing, we saw, Midland for a long time had the third lowest unemployment rate in the entire country. Texas as a state has seen its unemployment rate better than the national unemployment rate for so many months. But of course, these times, as they all do, inevitably come to an end or they slow, and we're going to need to be sure we have something else when that happens.
Well, I believe we have. I mean, wind undoubtedly was a big contributor, and as you indicated, 10%. We generate more wind in this state than any other state in the nation. We're by far, we're a leader in that regard. I think in terms of the power grid, the next big one to come along will be solar.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. The technology advances that are coming along are making it much more competitive. But a lot of these are technology driven. We saw wind technology get better. We're seeing solar technology getting better. We saw the technology getting better in terms of oil and gas and being able to develop shale. These are investments in technology which this state is better prepared than any other state in the union to be able to leverage.
Yeah.
With a good business climate and with a good labor force and a great educational system. Yeah. And so in that regard, across all forms of energy, we are very, very well positioned.
Chairman Darby, to that point, the perception is that your committee spends most of its time, all of its time on oil and gas. Tell me about some of the stuff that you're doing this session. Speak specifically about some of the stuff you're doing outside of the oil and gas portfolio on some of the issues you're talking about, wind, solar, and what have you.
You know, we are certainly looking at all forms of energy production. Solar, we've had several bills talking about solar initiatives. Wind, I know Chairman Frazier has got renewable energy portfolios on the legislative agenda. I'm sure we're going to
over in the Senate.
Over in the Senate, I'm sure we're going to hear several of those bills. But you know, we are focused on all types of energy generation and not just simply on oil and gas. Seems like 40 and the issue demarking the boundaries between regulatory certainty for the state and the cities, that is kind of preoccupied.
Well, it sucked a lot of the air out of the room, hasn't it?
It sucked a lot of the air, and we've been negotiating heavily to try to find that rifle shot that gets us to where we need.
So now that bill has passed the House, now you may
out of the House.
Move on to other things.
Now we're
Right.
moving on.
Ambassador Garza, to this point about the economy being a little bit softer in the oil and gas sector, there had been a lot of hopes for Texas and Mexico to get together, the opening of the Mexican energy opportunities, and that somehow that you would see a lot more stuff kind of cross-border.
Let me first just wrestle with the premise of your question
Yeah.
a little bit. When Evan asked, has the state done enough to diversify its economy? I think the state's role is simply about creating an environment where people will invest and grow the economy.
Right.
So the fact that we have grown a very robust and a big part of the engine in the Texas economy is oil and gas. I think the state did their part when they drew the boundary lines and they blessed us with favorable geology. Okay, and the economy has diversified. What the state can do well, and I think continue to, is build some of the infrastructure around that so
Right.
that you can move product to and from the market. If you can't move it to and from, you're stuck, right? And the second thing I think the state has to continue to invest in is education and higher ed in particular. Because as we move to a services and technology-driven economy, higher ed and having research institutions of the highest order is what's ultimately going to drive Texas towards competitiveness.
You want to take me to a different conversation.
no.
And I want to go there, believe me, but let me try to keep you on this.
No, I don't
Yeah.
want to go there, but I think that's where we have to position ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we look again, and I'll spend a little more time on Mexico because I think that's what you'd like me to do,
Yeah.
is you're looking at a country that was almost diametrically opposed to what we've done in Texas in terms of removing obstacles to the investment capital.
Right.
You had a state-owned industry in Pemex that for 80 years had essentially monopolized an industry. And what had they seen over the course of that 80 years is each year it became more corrupt, more inefficient, and more incapable of moving those resources from the subsurface to the surface in a way that would benefit the citizens and the people of Mexico. And about 18 months ago, they reformed that, and they started to the architecture, if you will, the legislation that would allow for private investment in a historically closed sector. And what you see now in Mexico, and I'm cautious, but I'm encouraged. I'm cautious because you see in the legislation and the constitutional reform what I would characterize as great architecture. And great architecture and great plans are something that's then handed to contractors. And so now we are in the implementation phase of it. The contractors have gone to work in the implementation of this legislation and constitutional reform against the backdrop of a tough economy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot easier when you have, a wind at your back of $80, $90, $100 oil as opposed to where it is.
52, 53.
At 52, 53. But there is an urgency because there's a recognition in that country that only by opening this up to private investment can you move the production in that country back to the numbers where it should be. There's a heavy dependence in terms of their public expenditures. 30% of them are based on revenues from that sector. And there's also recognition as they look around that, there was an energy revolution going on, the music was playing, and they weren't at the dance. And so when you see what's going on in the country against the backdrop of this industry, and yet you see a commitment to doing it, you've got to say that we are so well positioned as a state, and there are no better set of entrepreneurs and people that understand that industry than here in Texas. And if you look at the folks that are building, whether it's Kinder Morgan and building the pipeline, whether it's Energy Transfer, whether it's other investors, whether it's those in the first round of bids, a number of Texas-based companies, you recognize that independent of government, there's essentially some sort of transfer going on. I'm not going to call it a technology transfer in the traditional sense, but it's an expertise and capital that'll allow that country to grow in middle class, that'll allow us to expand an already $1 billion a day of trade a day with them.
Yeah.
So this is not an insignificant thing that we're watching. 5 years out, I think there's going to be a lot of shaking out in our industry here in the United States. That's the nature of these things. But 5 years out, I think we're also going to see a platform starting to develop in Mexico that this industry is going to have some tremendous opportunities down there.
Chairman Darby, before we open up to questions in the audience, let me ask you about the federal regulatory piece, alluded to a couple times on a couple different topics here. We have been in a defensive crouch against the federal government for some years here in Texas. We don't like it when the federal government comes in and decides things for us.
Well, do we want to have them XL pipelining every significant piece of infrastructure that we need in the state of Texas?
So my question to the chairman and to the rest of you is, what should the proper balance be? Think of this as a continuum. At one end of the continuum is the federal government dictates everything. At the other end of the continuum it is we effectively secede. Let's assume that we want to be at neither end of the continuum. Where along the continuum is the proper calibration point? What do we need? What do we want? What do we not want from the federal government as it relates to regulation of energy to enable for the next 5 years and beyond what we in this state are looking for?
Well, you're looking for me?
I am, most definitely. Start with the chairman.
Obviously, the federal government has a role in all of these matters, whether it be clean air, clean water.
You talk about the government having a role in clean air, you're going to get a primary opponent, Chairman.
Well, but the reality is they've delegated that authority to a Texas agency, the TCEQ, and so there's a relationship there, and there's a relationship between the federal government and our Railroad Commission, and our job is to make sure that our agencies properly administer those federal regulations and again, pursue the goals that those efforts are all about, whether it be clean air. I know there's some new standards coming down.
Yep.
Clean air that's going to impact our coal industry here in Texas, which impacts our natural gas industry.
And we're going to have to decide at that point, I think June is when we're going to see a new set of standards come down, and then we're going to have a year to come up with a plan ourselves or to decline to come up with a plan and to allow, by doing so, the federal government to set a plan for us.
Exactly. And
Should we take control of our fate and have that plan in place by June 2016, or should we
well, I think we're
step
working
aside?
towards that goal right now.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're working to be able to be prepared for that eventuality.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what those standards will be, but certainly there's a lot of folks here in Texas working to make sure Texas is prepared for that.
Mr. Bullock, what should our position be with regard to the federal government and its role in regulating or not regulating energy?
Well, we've clearly had the most anti-hydrocarbon administration in history in Washington. You clearly alluded to some things that they shouldn't be doing. There are also some things that they should do, things like the Keystone Pipeline. They should be letting loose some of these, more of these permits for NGL facilities on the Gulf Coast. So there are a lot of things that they can do proactively to help us out that are in their power to do so legally.
Lift the export ban.
Lift
for
the export
crude
ban.
oil.
Right now,
That-
the
that's
export
way
ban. The export ban has been in place for 40 years. If the export ban were lifted, that'd be a good thing, you think, for the state
I
of
think it
Texas?
would be a darn good thing for the state of Texas
And
and
ba-
for the United States and our balance of trade and for the ability of producers to meet that need.
Ambassador, you think the crude export ban should be lifted?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a ban put in place in the 70s when we were producing, 9.5 million barrels of crude per day. We saw that go down, and I guess in 2008 we were way low, and now we're nearly back at that. So even the rationale for the ban at the time no longer exists. I think when you remove obstacles to trade, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Representative, what about the federal government and its role in helping to regulate or, unhelpfully, depending upon your perspective, regulate?
There's not much that I could add to what both the panelists said
Right.
up here already, but I certainly agree with Chairman Darby on a number of things they shouldn't be doing, and obviously some things which are specifically in the purview, because as we all know, and as Ambassador Garza correctly pointed out, we were blessed with the unique state, and so therefore we should be the ones, by and large, making the decisions that deal with the exploration of oil.
On this, before we go to questions, on this issue of the EPA setting the standards and then giving Texas a year out to develop a plan, on the Affordable Care Act, Texas had the opportunity to set up a state exchange, declined to do so, and then the federal government created an exchange. We seem not to be willing to take responsibility on that issue for ourselves. We should be willing to take responsibility on the EPA standards. We should have a state plan, not allow the federal government to come in and make a plan for us.
No, I think as Chairman Darby correctly pointed out, there's certainly going to be a working relationship with the EPA, but by and large, I mean, we are the ones on the ground here. We are the ones that should be making the decision.
Make the determination for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Julie, we have a microphone there. We're going to walk around for questions from the audience. More than happy to have you ask. Hands go up. We'll take as many as time permit. We apologize in advance if 1 o'clock comes and we can't take everybody's questions. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Mark McCord. I'm director of Frac Dallas. And regarding HB 40, I'm going to make a couple of predicate statements, and then I'd like a clarification on some things.
Please get to your question for the benefit of everybody else, but go ahead.
HB 40 was written by the oil and gas industry attorneys and given to Chairman Darby to put his name on. It clearly defines the limits as commercial reasonable. That is indefensible in law. It's arbitrary and capricious. It's undefined. It leaves the burden of the interpretation on the industry that's being regulated, and it totally takes away the right of local citizens to have any say in what affects them in their personal lives. I'd like to know why you can claim that you believe in local government control and smaller government and then take away that authority from local citizens and give it to the big government.
Let me ask you if you would speak to the premise of the question, first of all, which is that the oil and gas industry wrote this bill, handed it to you, and that you put your name on it.
That is not correct. We work with the oil and gas industry and other industries to come up with a bill that we could file. Certainly, there's no question that the bill that came out of the Texas House of Representatives reflected the hard work of a lot of people, a lot of investment of time and effort by the Texas Municipal League and others representing cities, industries, pipelines, groundwater districts, environmental groups. The bill reflects the hard work in coming to a compromise.
Can you understand, though, why some, like this questioner, might feel like local communities are getting the short end of this, that their ability to self-determine, to set their own course is being taken away from them? Do you understand? Are you sympathetic at all to that?
Absolutely, I'm sympathetic. I would not have changed the bill to include a lot of the concerns that Mark has indicated to reflect that concern. Certainly, we set a standard, commercially reasonable, he mentioned. Of course, that term modifies reasonably prudent operator, which is a standard well established in Texas case law. So this is not an arbitrary and capricious standard. It is certainly one that is recognized and will be able to determine. It is an objective standard, not a subjective standard. It is not about the single operator's economic circumstances. It is about the reasonable prudent standard. We all understand what reasonably prudent means. It's not a high standard of prudence. It's not a low standard of prudence. It is an ordinary standard of prudence. And so we have, for the first time, established, Mark, some framework to view these ordinances. Let's face it, and I think even you would admit it, that some of these ordinances are not designed to regulate oil and gas operations. They're designed to eliminate oil and gas operations. And so my job is to make sure that we balance private property rights and the need of mineral owners in this state who have the dominant estate to develop and fully utilize their mineral interests and not waste those resources. And so this is an attempt to balance those two priorities. Now, is it perfect? You know, we'll meet again in 2 years, okay? The legislature, the Texas House of Representatives, and the Texas House will meet in 2 years. If we're out of whack, out of balance, we'll try to bring it back into balance. But this is an attempt, again, to thread that line and create a balance between private property rights and the right to utilize and exploit and fully develop mineral resources balanced with the powers of the cities. And so that's our attempt.
And if I could hop in just really quick,
Please.
because I was there. I worked with Chairman Darby and stakeholders and TML and their 1,100 members and saw Chairman Darby go to great lengths to make sure that there was a balance. This insinuation about being handed something by the oil and gas industry and then just being told what to do, which is really what you're saying, is just not true. It is just not true. Chairman Darby went to great lengths to make sure that cities had their say, and that was reflected in the changes in the bill.
Gentleman over here, sir.
Yeah, I have a question for the ambassador. Garza, actually, my last name is Garza, Joe Garza.
No relation?
Good to know you.
Beautiful last name, sir.
All right.
But
I think this is going well so far.
my question is more world events related. I know when Obama recently said they're going to agree to arm the Ukraine, Russia's said that they want to talk and negotiate with Mexico about the annexed states.
Excuse me, but
Russia, I was reading a couple articles the other day in Newsweek. They said that they want to negotiate with Mexico about the previously annexed states. There's 7 of them. And they said that essentially if we're going to arm the Ukraine, that Russia wants to negotiate with Mexico to either arm them or the previously annexed states to go to either side, one side or the other. Have you seen this come across?
no, not really. I would say almost a decade ago, there was some sense that you saw a bit more Russian meddling in the region via Chavez in Venezuela, and there was a lot more of that sort of activity. And it was in an environment, bringing it back to energy, where at the price levels, Venezuela could have a lot more sway in the Caribbean, and Russia was more active. But it's not something that I see much now. I will say what it points to, and I'm probably pivoting a little bit away from specifically your question. It points to the need to have a very robust hemispheric relationship. It points to the need to continue to integrate and converge around NAFTA. It points to the need, and I think two very good steps that were taken with respect to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the last couple of days coming out of the Senate Committee and the House Ways and Means in Washington. It points to the need to expand our trade relationships to encompass more countries and to embrace nearly 40% of the global economy. So I think when you hear stories like that or you see activities like that, what I think it should suggest to us as a country is the need to involve ourselves in a way, to trade freely, to show that kind of leadership, allow our private sector, quite frankly, to show the kind of leadership they do when they're allowed to trade freely in other markets. And it minimizes the sort of opportunities for the kind of thing that you're suggesting.
Okay.
In the back. Sir, and then we'll go right to the woman next to you. Got it, sir.
Yeah, this question's for Representative Darby and Meyer.
Yes.
There's been a lot of positive words spoken about renewable energy, solar and wind in Texas.
Yes.
And my understanding is that Senator Frazier's bill that's already passed out of the Senate that y'all will be voting on in the House actually eliminates the renewable energy portfolio standard that has helped create the Texas miracle in wind energy. And that wind energy companies are objecting to that heavily because they say it will cost jobs and economic development, which have been, very, very beneficial in those parts of Texas. So my question is that a bill that y'all will support in the Energy Resources Committee, and then when it reaches the House floor, or do you want to keep the renewable portfolio standard that we have in place that's helped create billions of dollars of investment in jobs in Texas?
Do you support that aspect, Chairman of the Fraser Bill?
I support the idea that those standards have created one of the most vibrant wind industry and solar industries that we have in the state.
Do you want to see that standard eliminated if that's indeed the consequence of the Fraser Bill?
I have not studied the issue, but certainly I would be very skeptical, again, of reducing the ability for this state to compete for renewable energy and certainly to maintain the momentum that we've exhibited. My biggest fear in building, investing $7 billion in CREZ lines is to not have anything on the end of them.
Right.
To justify the expense.
Representative, you have a problem with
No, I agree with Chairman Darby, and actually to that point, just this week in our committee, a bill authored by Representative Landgraf, which I am a joint author of, as well as Chairman Darby, helps to encourage additional use of renewable energy sources, actually, by encouraging state and local governments to convert their vehicle fleets to natural gas, to electric, to other type of renewable energy sources. And so we are on the Energy Committee, and obviously Chairman Darby and I, we are committed to having renewable energy, as I alluded to earlier, as part of our portfolio. We have to have it.
Right.
And so it is something which we are committed to.
House versus Senate drama is our favorite kind of drama. So I'm actually glad that we've identified that. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Cindy, and I live in Denton. And I just wanted to be clear that the fracking ban that we passed is just within the city limits. It's just, and there's already 300 gas wells within our city limits. It's not even in the territories that Denton owns, right outside of the city limits. There's up to 450 gas wells there, And I also want to be clear that we've been writing regulations for 5 or 6 years. I've been going to city council hearings for 6 years, and we didn't start trying to push a ban. We wrote a bunch of regulations, and industry was a bad actor, and they continued to not listen to our regulations. So my question is about what you say to the voters of Denton, especially people like me, young people who are really, really, really encouraged to vote and really encouraged to get involved and to care. And then we did, and we got 60% of our voting population to say, yeah, this industry isn't complying. We're not banning fracking in all of Denton's territories, just within our city limits. We're going to prioritize our health. And now y'all are telling me we can't do that. You're not allowed to do that.
There is
so what
a
do you
point
say to the voters of Denton?
There is a point about Chairman Darby about, elections have consequences. People turn out to vote. We encourage people to turn out to vote, to get activated. We're trying to combat lack of engagement. People turn out to vote, they vote, and then the minute they vote for something that the legislature doesn't like, they're told your vote doesn't count. That is one view of this. What do you respond to that?
A voter initiative is great. That's what our country's built upon. However, you cannot, by voter initiative, preempt state law or federal law. And that's exactly the point we're trying to make. The state has preemption powers with regard to the regulation of drilling completion techniques. Let's face it, fracking is a process of completion on an oil and gas well. That is under the purview of the state of Texas to delegate that authority to the Railroad Commission. And so any attempt to intrude into the regulatory authority of the state, I have to deal with.
So the theory
and so
here
we have dealt with that.
Theory here is, Chairman, that voters can put anything on the ballot that they want, and they can vote for anything that they want, but ultimately it can't take effect if it runs afoul of
state or federal law.
state or federal law.
I don't want to beat this point again, but I do think it points to the need for the Railroad Commission to really do their job.
Step up and do its job, right.
And to step up and have the resources and recognize and appreciate that as a regulator, the industry will always be there and represented, that their job many times is to represent those that aren't at the table and to take a longer term view of it, to be a steward for the natural resources of the state.
Sir.
If you don't mind. Ambassador Garza, this is for you. Recently, Texas has just passed a law or an exemption to a law that allows crowdfunding for different, it's actually an equity crowdfunding platform.
Is this the Texas Tribune deal for the river initiative? Or aren't you doing a crowdfunding thing?
The different crowdfunding.
Well,
but thank you for the shout out. That's okay.
Well, the irony is actually we started the first oil and gas crowdfunding for equity positions in Texas. And what we were wondering is if there's an opportunity for Mexico to be able to do some sort of reciprocation to allow for when they have deregulated it, there's another opportunity to bring that technology and that investment into Mexico at some point.
You know, the short answer is I don't know. But I will tell you, just as an aside, and I'll try to do this quickly. Last week, I met with a young man, 23 years old, Carlos Gutierrez. He is the founder of the hackathon movement in Mexico. And those of you that are familiar with that, it's something that's really taken off and kind of encouraged and spurred the tech community here in the country. It was nice to see that going on in Mexico. And his next step was into in a very small but growing angel investor and venture capital things. So I don't know that that possibility is today or tomorrow, but what I do see is because of the prospect of reform, because of the prospect that that country has some opportunities, and no doubt the challenges remain with respect to security and rule of law, but because of that, it wouldn't surprise me at all if crowdfunding and these are sorts of much more collaborative and kind of technology-driven opportunities aren't out there for investment in that sector.
Okay, last question right here.
I'm Faith Chatham, and I'd like to go back to a larger constitutional process. And I would love to see a forum on this, maybe by the maybe by SMU and maybe the Texas Tribune. Looking at constitutional law, I know that the legislature moves very fast, but it appears that there is a conflict, and some of us have questions about whether House Bill 40 should have been a constitutional amendment rather than a bill.
Did you all investigate that, Chairman Darby?
Yes.
And what did you?
We felt it was within the purview of the legislature to act on behalf of constitutional authority that we already had.
So it didn't need to go to a referendum of the voters?
That's correct.
Statewide. All right. All right, well, we got to stop here. We're unfortunately at 1 o'clock. Please thank our panelists. Great conversation. Great to have them here. Thank you to SMU. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Very good.